I had a brief conversation recently with somebody, and their dog died. And I wanted to offer my condolences and give a hug and say how sorry I was that their dog had died. You can always tell by how much an animal means to somebody by how they react when this animal dies. Some people, their animal dies and it's no big deal. They bury it and they move on. And other people, the animal is like a member of the family. And they're grieving tremendously about this death. And I could tell for this particular person, it was the latter, that this dog really, really meant a lot to this person. And they were grieving because of it. Another person in the room asked if the company gave a bereavement policy for the death of an animal. And this person actually said, no, I looked into it and they don't do that, but I can take a personal day of grieving, which I've done. And I thought to myself, I didn't even know that this was a thing, that companies were offering bereavement policies for pets. I'm not against it. I didn't know about it. And I thought, I wonder if I should be offering a bereavement policy for people at Christ Lutheran Vail when their pets die. I mean, it's not a bad idea, particularly if it's a well-loved pet or one that's been around for a long time. I did some research, and apparently this is a thing. It has started in Europe, and many companies in Europe are giving bereavement policies or bereavement time to people when their pets die. It's very popular in Canada. I looked at some of the companies here in the United States, and there are a few companies that give bereavement policies. There's one that's a pet insurer. It's called like Trulion or something like that. Trupanion, they have a pet grievance policy. There's also a software company that has a pet grievance policy called VMware. In the Bay Area, in San Francisco, there's quite a few companies that actually offer pet bereavement policies. Although Apple and Google and Amazon, as near as I can tell, do not offer a policy yet, although many people think that it's likely coming. And maybe, who knows, maybe you all work for a company that has a pet bereavement policy. And I was just surprised by this because I didn't know about it. But if you're a manager, how do you deal with this? How do you deal with the death of a pet? Particularly if you see that your employee is clearly grieving. You know, some managers might simply ignore it and say, it's just a pet, get over it, move on, get your work done, and that sort of thing. I'm sure you probably wouldn't do that. Some managers would say, it's just a personal thing. I'm not going to get involved in your life because it's a personal thing, but I'm sorry. Others might give a card. Some managers might even pray over their employee, say, ask for God's strength to get through the grieving. Some would never do that because it's not allowed in your company policies. And some managers might actually see that this is really serious, and even if it's against company policy, might give some time off to do that. If your company does not have a grievance policy, what do you do? I mean, do you start lobbying your company to say, we really should have a pet grievance policy, or is that a little bit over the top? I don't know. What does a good manager do? What is a good leadership strategy? This whole Lent, we've been looking at leadership through Jesus' eyes. And 2 weeks ago, we looked at leadership as an act of service, that Jesus wants us to serve. Last week, we talked about leadership and what you do when you've been betrayed. Today, we're going to talk about what is at the core of any leadership strategy, any leadership principle. This is the core at everything that Jesus did. If you're going to be a leader or a manager or involved in leading people, this is something you must absolutely do. And what is this thing? It's called love. Everything that Jesus did was about love. Love God, love your neighbor, but at its core, love. But what exactly is love? And how do we show it? And how do we love? And particularly when people need it at times in their life. And that's the question we're going to look at today. We're continuing to read in John chapter 13, and we will continue reading beginning at verse 31, where John writes this. When he was gone, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself and will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. One of the things that all the Gospels write about is that Jesus seems to be destined or set his sight on Jerusalem. He is going into Jerusalem. His disciples know that he's going to Jerusalem. Something's going to happen. They're not exactly sure what is going to happen, but they know it's going to be big. And Jesus has set his eyes on Jerusalem. He's going to Jerusalem, but now he's in the upper room, and the time has come. And what is this time? Jesus knows that he's going to die. He says he will only be with them a little while, and then he will be gone. And Jesus says, this is a glorious thing. You will see my glory. You will see God's glory. This is a glorious thing. And then Jesus talks about one last word to his disciples. And what is his last word? But love. As I have loved you, I call you to love one another. It's a new commandment. All the Old Testament commandments can be boiled down into two things: love God and love your neighbor as yourself. But Jesus even boils it down to one simple word: love. You must love one another. As I have shown you love, you need to love one another. It's interesting, the Greeks had a whole lot of different words for love. You may have heard of a few of them, but some of them you may not have actually heard of before. Here's one that you may not have heard of before. It's called erototropia. Erototropia. It's that courting love. It's a flirting love. It's a love that hasn't solidified. We're just kind of seeking to see if love exists. And so we're talking to each other. Erototropia. When I was dating Jennifer, I went over to her house the first time, and there on the wall was a whole bunch of musical instruments because Jennifer's father was a director of music at Arizona State University. And so he taught music, and he had a lot of musical instruments in the house. And on the wall was mounted what they call a courting dulcimer. Now, a courting dulcimer, it was a device used in the Middle Ages where two people would play the dulcimer at the same time. And as they're both playing the dulcimer, you could tell that two people are playing, and so they were allowed to go in a room, close the door, and be by themselves. They would not be disturbed as long as the music was playing. As soon as the music stopped, then the door would open, and whatever was inside that would be revealed. Oh, and so if you wanted to court somebody and you wanted to make sure that you could have some privacy doing the courting, then you played this courting dulcimer. And I remember Jennifer's father saying, and you need to learn how to play this because I'm never letting you be alone with my daughter. But there was not any worry because Jennifer didn't know how to play the thing either. And it was just a talking point, actually. Another type of love in the Greek that you may not have heard of is called mania, manic love. It's an actual love in the Greek New Testament, in the Greek world. And this is a type of love that doesn't require anybody to reciprocate. It's a mania love. You are in love with somebody, but they may not even know that you exist. When I was dating Jennifer and I looked in her room, she had posters on the wall of various singing artists from the 70s. There was David Cassidy and Andy Gibb and all these guys. And young girls, when they're in their teens, they just sit there and they adore these men, these young boys. But these guys don't have a clue that there's no reciprocation there whatsoever. They were all singers and they all had long hair. So I figured I had to be a singer and a long hair if I was going to have Jennifer love me in a manic type love. You may have heard of this one. It's called eros. It's where we get the word erotic. It's the love that typically is between a husband and a wife, often results in children. The difference is that today, eroticism or erotic, that word has a kind of a bad connotation or a bad feeling to it. But there's nothing bad about it at all. It's just a more of a physical love, and it's a love that people have for each other, which is not a bad love at all. As a matter of fact, it's a very complete and fulfilling love. There's philos, that type of love. It's brotherly love. You may remember Philadelphia as the city of brotherly love. This is love that is not physical. It's just a very deep affection that two people that have between each other. There's also another love called storge love. Storge love. It's a Greek word that means family love. It's not erotic. It's not fellowship or brotherly love. It's an actual deep family love that you would have for each other, your brothers, your sisters, your mom or dad. My brother-in-law has a great memory device for this type of love, and he thinks of a stork. Because, the stork comes and that's your family, and so you have family love. I think a stork is more for erotic love, but, everyone has their own memory devices to help them in these things. But is that the love we're talking about here? If you go to the Greek word and you look up in John chapter 13, and you look at this passage, it's actually a different type of love. It's the Greek word agape. It's agape love. Agape love is known as selfless love. Self-sacrificing love. In the Old Testament, they had a word for this. It was called chesed, chesed love. It's the steadfast, everlasting love that God had for Israel. It's a love that never fades, a love that never dies, a love that's always there. It's a love that gives and gives and gives. Chesed love, agape love. Some have called it divine love. It's the love that God has for us. It's a love that God has for you. And of all the loves in the Greek language, this is the pinnacle of that love, the agape love. All the other loves pale in comparison or are subsets of this one love, which is a self-sacrificing love. This is the love that Jesus is talking about. But even this love can be difficult to quantify, because self-sacrificing means what? You're going to sacrifice something for somebody else. But you can do that type of love on a continuum. And you might think of a continuum as like a number between 0 and 10. And a 0 or a 1 type of sacrifice might be, somebody comes into your office and says, my dog just died. And you get off your chair and you go sit down next to them and you say, I'm so sorry, and tell me about your dog, and you give them a hug or might even pray over them. And it has cost you very little, but you do it anyway. But then it might increase. There might be other types of ways to love somebody that increases the amount of sacrifice that's necessary. You might have to fight. Somebody's grieving, and your company doesn't have a grievance policy, but you can see that they absolutely need to have a day off, and so you might give them the day off with pay, so that they can spend time grieving. And you know that all the other people in the company are going to be angry that you did this. But you know it was the right thing to do. You might have to fight for a little bit. You might risk your own career a little bit to do something like that, but you know it's the right to do it, because love always requires sacrifice. And then you get to the very top of the sacrifice that's necessary. And the number 10 in the agape love is when you would be willing to sacrifice your very own life. That would be a 10 type sacrifice, where you love somebody so much that you'd be willing to let your own life be taken so that they might live. Many, many parents have this kind of love for their children. They'd be more than willing to give up their own life so that their kids would live. And this is the type of love that God has for us. This is a self-sacrificing 10 type agape love. This is what Jesus is talking about. But even Jesus is talking about a love that's a bit deeper than this. Let's keep reading in verse 36. Simon Peter asked, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus replied, where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. Where is Jesus going? He's going to the cross to die. And we know that when Jesus died, he descended into hell. He proclaimed victory over Satan. He rose again, came back to earth, and then ascended into heaven and lives with God eternally forever. We know that this death that Jesus did was a death type of sacrifice. You might think that that's a 10, but it's actually a little bit more than 10. Because when Jesus died and he did that ultimate sacrifice, one of the things he did was that he separated himself from God himself, the love of the universe. That God, when he died, took upon himself all the sins of the world, separated himself from God, and experienced a true death that is greater than anybody else will ever experience. Because he experienced a true sacrifice. You could almost call this an 11 type sacrifice. It's a sacrifice that none of us will ever have to experience. None of us will have a death that separates us from God, because even as we die, we're going to be safe in God's arms. And that is only available to us because Jesus did the ultimate death and the ultimate sacrifice, taking all the sins and the brokenness of the world upon himself so that we would never, ever have to be separated from God. That's the type of sacrifice that Jesus is talking about. When Peter says, wherever you're going, I want to go with you, Jesus says, you can't. He says, someday you may follow me into death, but where I'm going, you simply cannot go. The only person that ever did this type of sacrifice was Jesus. I know many parents who want to sacrifice for their children and give everything for their children. And they might even give up their life for their children, but they won't do this like Jesus did for his children. What parent wouldn't stop and do whatever they could for their children? But the only person in history who ever could do this type of sacrifice was Jesus. He's the only person that was ever able to do this, and he did it for you. How do you know what type of sacrifice to do? How do you know if the sacrifice is a 1 or a 2 sacrifice or 11 or 12 sacrifice? You pray to God for wisdom. But even in sacrificing yourself for your family, let's say you wanted to sacrifice yourself from a family, what does that do to everybody else? Let's say you have one child. I once knew a lady who had a child who had been addicted to drugs, and this person wanted to give up everything for this child. But she had more than one child. She had other family members, and she couldn't give up entirely everything for this child because that would leave the other children childless. And how do you know which child you want to spend all your time and sacrifice on and which child you don't? And the only thing I can say is it takes wisdom, it takes understanding from God, and none of us will ever get it right. But Jesus got it right. Jesus did the ultimate sacrifice. The only person that can love everybody at all time is God. The only one that can do a sacrifice that Jesus did for everybody is God. All the rest of us have to make choices. And in those choices, sometimes we'll make the wrong choice. But Jesus loves us anyway, because Jesus sacrificed himself so that we could be in the kingdom. Sometimes when I'm talking to people about marriage, they'll say, I don't want to have children. And I think to myself, and why not? And it's just too much work, and it's too expensive, and it's too much of a sacrifice. And for some people that may be true, but for others, they need to be shown, or they should see in Scripture how, yes, it's a sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice that's worth it. I see today in the United States, the birth rate is continuing to decline. And the cost of having children is outrageous, and it's very, very expensive. And I had children 30 years ago, so I don't know how expensive it is today. But children are always a sacrifice. But it's a sacrifice that's worth it, because in the end you get a deeper love, because sacrifice and love are always linked and connected. And so sacrifice is just another way of saying love. The two are connected. In the business world, you might have to allow somebody to take a day off when they're grieving, and you might have to make a sacrifice to allow them to do that. You might have to risk your job. But I guarantee you that none of you will ever make the sacrifice that Jesus made. When he came into Jerusalem, set his eyes on Jerusalem and said, I'm going to sacrifice my whole very life and give up my divinity to separate myself from God so that no person would ever have to go through that, which is what he did. But Peter goes on. We'll continue reading in verse 37. Peter asked, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. And Jesus answered, will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. So here's another problem about sacrifice. We may be willing to give up our life for somebody else, But when it really, really comes down to it, sometimes the flesh is weak. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And because we have a weak flesh, we may not actually be willing to sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice. There have been many people in history that have. Even Peter did. Eventually, Peter grew and saw the sacrifice that Jesus made, and he was able to see that sacrifice himself. But what changed? What changed is that Peter saw something. And what Peter saw was that he saw his friend Jesus die, but then he saw Jesus rise again. See, the only way that we would be willing to make that ultimate sacrifice is if we can understand that death is not the end. That even in giving up the ultimate sacrifice, it's not the ultimate, because it's just a temporary thing, but we will be in the arms of Jesus forever. Any sacrifice that involves death is not a permanent death, but it's just a temporary death. The grave is a garden, and someday we will rise out of that garden and be with Jesus forever. And the only strength that we get, the only reason we could ever give up our life for anybody, is to understand that death is not the final answer. And that's what Peter saw. Peter saw that Jesus rose again from the dead, and eventually at the end of his life, Peter and all but the gospel writer of John sacrificed themselves and did the ultimate sacrifice of their death for you and for me. Peter and the other disciples did give up their lives for Jesus, the ultimate sacrifice, but it wasn't the death that was permanent. It was just a temporary death. Now, if you're a manager, you won't be able to completely love the people that you manage. It is impossible, but you should try. You should love. And if there is a bit of a sacrifice, that's okay. But don't do it just for the company to keep the employee happy or that sort of thing. Do it because you've seen the sacrifice of Jesus and you want to follow his example. And you know that love always requires sacrifice, and that you're willing to give that sacrifice to love the world around us, to follow Jesus' commandments. Brothers, love one another as I have loved you. I'll close with this story. There was a brother and his sister that fought a lot. In fact, they fought almost every day, and they hardly had a nice word to say about each other until one summer they both came down with this rare sickness, this rare blood disorder. Now, the boy actually was able to get through this. His immune system was strong, and he got through the blood disorder, but his sister wasn't quite so good. She was getting sicker and sicker by the moment. The doctor who had been treating them sat down with the boy and explained this grave situation. And he asked, would you be willing to give some of your blood? Would you give your blood to your sister? The doctor's surprised. The boy hesitated a bit. The boy looked down at the floor and he thought about it, and he seemed to be thinking about it quite a bit. And finally he snapped out of it and he says, yes, I'll do it. I'll save her. And after hearing this, the doctor was pleased. He took them both into a room and he started the blood transfusion. He put a needle in the boy and a needle in the girl, and the blood started to flow from him to her. And as the boy looked, his sister in bed next to him receiving this blood, he could see that she was actually getting better in front of her eyes, in front of his eyes. He could see that the color was returning to her cheeks. He had been so pale, and he smiled at her. And then he began to become afraid. He turned to the doctor and he said in a trembling whisper, can I ask you a question? Of course, anything, said the doctor. I was just wondering, said the boy, will I start to die right away? On hearing that, the doctor almost dropped the clipboard that he was holding. Apparently, the little boy thought that agreeing to the blood transfusion meant that he would give all of his blood to his sister and that he would die because of it. But the doctor immediately explained to him that he wasn't going to die, and then he understood why the hesitation. The boy thought in order to help his sister, he himself had to die, but he was willing to do that for his sister. My friends, that's agape love. That's the love that God has for you and for me. It's the love that we strive for in the world that we serve. We fail miserably, but because we fail, that doesn't separate us from God's love, because God's love is perfect. His love, his everlasting sacrificial love is perfect. And the things that we don't do don't separate us from his love at all, because he loves us. We won't get it right. And very few of us will be called to make the ultimate sacrifice. Some people may, but very few of us will be called to make that type of sacrifice. But there was one person who did make the ultimate sacrifice. On a scale of 0 to 10, it was an 11. And that was Jesus in his perfect, everlasting sacrifice for you that never fails. Would you join me in prayer? Gracious God, we thank you for your sacrifice. We thank you that you loved us so much, that you risked everything, that you gave up everything for us. Help us, Lord, to have wisdom to see how to love people around us. We ask this in your name. Amen. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. Amen. Just a few announcements that I have. First of all, this last week we had VBS. And so thank you to all the people who helped with VBS. It was a very, very successful week and really, really enjoyed it. So a big, big warm thank you to everybody that did that. Also, Discover CLV, we're going to do one on Wednesday nights beginning April 12th. So there's dinner at 6 o'clock, and then at 6:30 we meet for a brief period of time for Discover CLV. If you want to be a part of that group, come join us on April 12th. Sign up in the church office so we know you're coming. Holy Week is coming up. That's Monday, Thursday. We have a service at 6 o'clock. Good Friday, there's a service at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. And then on Easter Sunday, we'll have an Easter Sunday sunrise service at 6 a.m. And then our normal Easter Sunday at 9 o'clock a.m. So you're welcome to join us for all of those things. And then we're having a Vail community picnic on March 25th. We did this last year. It was highly successful. It's from 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock. It's open to the Vail community. It's free food and lots of good games, and it should be a lot of fun. So tell people about that. We've given a flyer to all the Vail School District schools. So hopefully we'll see some of those people and be able to love them. And other than those are the announcements. I pray that you have a great week. Go in peace and serve the Lord with joy. Thanks be to God.